So with no further ado, I'm just going to introduce our fabulous speakers tonight, Youngsook, Monica, and Jessie. I'm going to have to let people in at the same time. So to start, I've got Jessie. Jessie is a Malaysian Chinese dance artist. There she is waving. She's a choreographer and writer as well, and she's based in London. Currently, she's a Leverhulme Arts Scholar in MFA choreography, with her research centered around the constructs of memory and space through dance and poetic narratives. Sorry, Vicky, I might be going a bit too fast. Our BSL interpreter, I might be speaking too fast. Okay, so slow down. Youngsook Choi is her practice relates to the subjective position as a woman, a mother, and migrant of Korean heritage, coming from a working class background. Her recent performances explore the concept of political spirituality and intimate aesthetics of community actions. And then finally, we've got Monica. Monica is an Asian American and neurodivergent artist based in London. Her collaborative and multidisciplinary projects are informed by marginalized lived experiences and the desire for creating spaces of community within the human and more than human world. So welcome to our speakers. We have all three of them joining us tonight because they are together. Have You Eaten Yet? An initiative that was born in the last year or so, I would say. I should have checked that with you. But it culminated in a series of performances and events in July this year. And it was kind of exploring different rituals and ways of being in East Asian diaspora. So we're super, super happy to have them talk about that project and also to explore some of the ideas and the thinking and the experiences that have spurred this project to happen in the first place. So maybe Youngsook, Monica, and Jessie, you can turn your microphones on and we can start kind of setting the scene for the conversation. And Youngsook has this wonderful passage that she would like to share with everyone tonight. Can we maybe use that as a preamble then to the conversation?
Sure. Thanks, Sunshine, for the introduction, and thank you everyone to make time with us this evening. We're going to start the conversation, as Sunshine said, by reading a little passage from Ocean Vuong. It's true that in Vietnamese, we rarely say, I love you. And when we do, it is almost always in English. Care and love, for us, are pronounced clearest through service. Plucking white hairs, pressing yourself on your son to observe a plane's turbulence, and therefore his fear. Or now, as a land called to me, little dog, get over here and help me help your mother. And we knelt on each side of you, rolling out the hardened cords in your upper arms, then down to your wrists, your fingers. For a moment, almost too brief to matter, this made sense. The three people on the floor, connected to each other by touch, made something like the word family. This passage from Ocean Vuong also reminds me of the conversation we had with Sunshine, our host. Sunshine shared her fond memory of her mom placing a hard-boiled egg on her palm and insisting she eats it before leaving home. I simply cannot find any suitable words to describe this caring moment. Our elderly's never-ending worry for our empty stomachs. The question, have you eaten yet, in various parts of Asia, which is equivalent to, how are you, in the West carries this ethics of tangible care towards one's livelihood and health. When I came to this country, the most confusing question was, how are you? It took a while for me to understand this question doesn't really inquire how I am. If I give a matter of fact answer, it will break the protocol. And people wouldn't know how to deal with my honesty or find a way to avoid responding to it. And perhaps this contrast between have you eaten yet and how are you is the point we are trying to make sense of here. Making an affectionate space requires tangible care, and tangible care requires understanding of the needs and resources accordingly. Not the lip service that you love us, welcome us, and drop the breadcrumb money for us to compete fiercely or wear off with burnout. Unfortunately, we often find ourselves in this kind of lip service. We love you. They love me because I'm the only POC and woman in the white people's room, a double whammy for their diversity palette. I feel vulnerable and lonely in this kind of invitation. As Frantz Fanon said, I enter the list that only recognizes me as ethnic and a minority, but not necessarily challenging the root causes why I'm always a minority, why I'm on the list but have no territory on the map. And that's exactly how Jessie and Monica, sorry, Jessie and Monica and me met. How this is exactly how we met, through the gate of this particular list.
Yes, and the gate that we're talking about is I will introduce a bit how we met. So we met through the Deptford X peer network, which was recently set up over the pandemic era, the pandemic period of this year, I believe. Yeah, it is this year, sorry. And I was reflecting actually how this Deptford X network started, and actually it had roots in the previous year, so 2020, when I believe we all one way or another attended these workshops, these online workshops held by Deptford X of POC artists delivering different topics and again webinars and workshops topics. I attended an amazing visual artist, Shawanda Corbett's On Galleries workshop. And I believe Monica and Youngsook, you've attended, possibly attended other workshops as well. So that was where I remembered the roots of what led to the peer network, because Deptford X then developed it into, reached out to the many of us that attended in the prior year, and then asked whether we were interested in further developing. I was one of them that said yes, and here we are. So yeah, this peer network is in a simple form, in a simple sentence, is like an evolving group of Black and POC artists, cultural producers, arts organizers affiliated with Deptford X. So this group is very new, it's still in its infancy stages, and it's still, going through the motions of being developed into certain structures. And generally, what the Deptford X institution would provide for us is would support us in developing and leading programming, to try things out, seek mentors for workshops on an ongoing basis, offer advice, guidance, and connections. And also, we partake in the platforms and festivals that they hold. They have an annual festival, Deptford X Festival. It's a visual arts festival that surrounds the areas of the Lewisham Borough, which is Southeast London. So if you're not really familiar, it is the postcode of SE8 and SE13, I think, right? Was it? SE13, so Southeast London area. And also the Deptford, Lewisham Borough, specifically Deptford, it is a place that has a high concentration of the Southeast Asian community, especially Vietnamese, the Vietnamese community. So yeah, so just to give you a little background on, you know, Deptford itself, the Southeast London area. And so yeah, so Monica, Youngsook, and I met here. And this peer network essentially became a catalyst for further thought through our encounters and meeting of our practices. And I think one of the things that really was this catalyst that I speak of is when we all gathered together, the group of us POC artists and producers, cultural producers, I think especially like I remember very clearly there's a lot of questions of, so now what? So what are we doing here? Especially like from my end personally, I also raised these questions. You know, what is it that the institute that is needed and wanted from us, and what should we do from here? It wasn't clear at the get-go. As I said, is an evolving group, so it wasn't too clear at the get-go how we are supposed to structure or run this sort of body, this new body, you know. And I think the question of agency is came up for me a lot on how we could develop this network, this peer network, and of course beneath it also understanding, okay, the positions and the power structures that were in play, and how that would, you know, how we could find our way into establishing what is needed amongst the group of us POC artists and producers. I think I'd also like to share a passage from Ocean Vuong, a lot of passages from Ocean Vuong tonight, but this is paraphrased actually by by Trish Pham. So it talks about agency in a very clear way, or it brings up the questions for it. It says here, when it comes to the Asian American innovation and agency, we are often legible when we are at service to larger structures and art, often Eurocentric ones. But when it comes to your own thinking, your own creation, you will not be legible. You will be inconceivable. As an Asian American, when you dare to have your own agency, your own dreams, when you no longer become the instrument, the empty vessel of larger pre-made art, you will be called pretentious. You will be called unrestrained. They will not be ready for your mind when it creates its own things. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You should do it, but be prepared, expect it, and even more so, why not? Why not be as ambitious as you want to be? Why not be pretentious? What is pretentious but to have the pretense, the assumption that you belong here? Be prepared to be inconceivable and be prepared to innovate beyond that. Because we need you and we are ready for you. So that's the passage. I've also shared it in chat. I think before I pass it on to Monica, I think to wrap up my thoughts on this passage, which is also, I think, posited within my own experience or within even within the Europe's sort of the Western Hemisphere in general. I think it is very easy to place a POC individual at the forefront to display the stories, vulnerability, and call that perhaps inclusivity. But to me, sometimes I don't think it is. It can feel like being in a circus, and these stories of struggle and resilience become only, I think, diversity tokens spent and consumed within what I see as what is seen as the post-colonial world, without actual integration of the effects of history until today. And that includes access and visibility within the arts and culture industry and beyond. So yeah, we're talking about the agency of being able to take up space to create and produce work. And on that note, I'd love to pass on to Monica to talk more about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie. So just to sort of like add a little bit of sort of context to like what we did. So we were asked within the context of this peer network to curate projects for the festival over the summer. And so that's sort of like how all of this came about, with these questions of like, what does it mean to sort of like be asked to be at the forefront of like curating our own initiatives, and like how much is being asked of us, what is expected of us, and what kind of content are the organization's audiences expecting to see. So I think that's sort of some of the big questions that we were working through at the time. And within the context of the Arts Council England investment principles, since we were invited here to sort of like talk about sort of like our collective in relation to how these funding structures are sometimes over determining arts practices. So I think that's a bit the territory that we wanted to get into in this section. So I think a lot of the times, like what we are feeling as practitioners are a certain set of like expectations to fulfill these criteria, and a sort of like almost like a box ticking exercise, so that organizations can justify the funding that they're getting from Arts Council England. So Arts Council England has set out these 4 investment principles, which are ambition and quality, dynamism, environmental responsibilities, and inclusivity and relevance. And so it was really interesting for us to be invited in this context to be able to think some of that through, and the ways in which we sort of like experience this in practice. So regarding ambition and quality, I think that like when it comes to being practitioners of Asian diaspora, like we still need to remember that we're still working in through and around a sort of cultural hegemony of white dominated institutions, and that hopefully what the investment principles mean, and that what Arts Council says is that they want to sort of revise the organizations that will come and go over the next 30 years. Maybe we're not wrong to be sort of like skeptical about how that's going to play out in practice though. And there's sort of one example that I keep returning to when I think about quality and validation for how we understand quality, and how the sort of like chain reaction of who's going to take power in the cultural scene is going to play out. So in my opinion, this past year has been wonderful in many ways for the art and stories that have emerged from the diaspora. The example that I am thinking about in particular is Lee Isaac Chung's Minari. So I read an interview that he gave pre-award season a while back, where he was worried that Han Ye-ri's performance, so who plays Monica Yi, the mother in the film, would go overlooked by Western audiences and critics because the artistry in her performance was really in the details, the quiet moments, the way that she would brush her son's shoulders, the subtlety of her expressions as she held on to her emotions. So the kinds of details, like the way that you would turn down the bed, things like that. For Chung, her performance was what made that film. But he was concerned that Western audiences would pick up on those subtleties, on that kind of care, and the expression of care as being really like the powerful part of the film, rather than the sort of more dramatic moments that happen in that work. So anyways, that example got me thinking about where terms like quality and especially ambition become problematized, because ambition can express itself quietly. And when I think about what quality is, and when I think about what quality is in East Asian terms, it's the quietness that moves me, not the dramatic moments. Whereas the inverse might be more valuable, might be of more value in Western cultural production, which thrives on the theater of politics and celebrity, kind of, which is a very neoliberal thing. And so the Arts Council acknowledges, by the way, the subjective complexity, like subjectivity and complexity of like how you define quality. And sort of what they say as an antidote to that is that they will inevitably, like in the end, fall back on their experience and expertise to make these judgment calls. But I'm still left with the question of what does that really mean in practice? So Asian diaspora as creators and tellers of our experiences and family histories, and calling this our art, is still very much in a nascent phase. In many ways, our stories started becoming more visible and more prominent because of the events of COVID-19 pandemic and the racialized rhetoric behind it. And it's amazing because it's led to so many powerful works, and in many ways, it's been a moment for Asian artists to come together and start finding each other and connecting and sharing stories that we previously wouldn't in the past. But it's like, we're still in the very, I would say, early stages of like defining what does this collective aesthetic mean, what does it mean to take up space. Even when I was at university, I was pressed by white tutors to talk about my identity, which actually annoyed me quite a lot at the time. But it's like we're trying to raise here. And what we'll sort of like talk about this, this poet and writer later, Cathy Park Hong in Minor Feelings. So we're gonna reference this text later. Let me just write that in the chat. So Cathy. So Minor Feelings was published in 2020. And one of the things that Cathy Park Hong was talking about was how there wasn't much, even as she was going through art school and during her time of finding poetry and becoming a writer, there wasn't much of a canon for Asian diaspora art and literature. So the pressure and the discomfort was too much for a young art student to contend with such an unspecific we. So in the book, Hong talks about being afraid to sort of like claim a we that is still forming. So she sort of like reverted to speaking about her experiences in terms of an I, which is again something that a lot of Asians have a lot of discomfort doing. And it was like the reason why I was uncomfortable when my tutors were kind of insisting that I do it too. Because as Hong puts it, that literally amounts to 2 billion people in the world between people who live in Asia and diasporas. So there's this nascent phase happening now where we're grappling with geographic, cultural, and cross-cultural, and as well as interracial, I'm mixed race, so, and personal histories, and how we talk in acknowledgement of that complexity about what is Asianness. So I want to tie that back into like the inclusivity and relevance question, because so inclusivity and relevance and tying that back up to ambition and quality, I do wonder where the wiggle room for experimentation comes in those investment principles. Because for a diaspora that is probably just now starting to come into its own as creators, artists, activists, because it takes about 2 to 3 generations to reach this point, and when we arrive, our aesthetics might not meet those institutional criteria. A lot of us come from backgrounds where our parents and our grandparents who migrated were service workers, and cross that threshold from being working class, from being a service worker into the arts is a really big step for us. And also just inevitably, I remember one time at school, someone had said to me, being in the arts is inherently a kind of privilege. Like once you've arrived in the arts, you have some privilege. And I didn't really understand what that meant at the time. So yeah, and I think this is kind of like where we've arrived with Have You Eaten Yet? And trying to create like our own collective aesthetics and a space, like creating affectionate space as that aesthetics. And as to who that is speaking for and to, it will, I think, become apparent over the course of time. But yeah, I'm going to pass it to Youngsook now, who's going to expand on that.
Yeah, just add up kind of a few aspects around this inclusivity and diverse practice. I found it's often just about representing POC bodies and extracting the exotic or ethnic content from us. And in that situation, sometimes you feel even more vulnerable. And at the same time, you're under massive pressure that you are also representing your community. Because as Monica said, you made into that privileged space. And so if your work is about Asian heritage, you're considered to take a risk of ghettoizing your practice. If your work is not about being Asian, you're accused of ignoring or dishonoring your heritage. I think this is such a baggage probably only POC artists often carry. I cannot imagine any white artist is juggling between this kind of identity related practice or not identity related practices. And not to mention Asia as an umbrella vessel, which is almost impossible to pin it down as one identity. Yet, mixing with the South Asian, Southeast, and East Asian is not unusual misidentification we often face from the institutions, which clearly shows their lack of initial research and genuine interest in our communities. This representation-focused diversity practice doesn't really shake up how the institutions operate or promise any tangible commitment. It's like you see the solidarity statement for Black Lives Matter at the foyer of the building. If you go inside office, all the staff working in that institution are 100% white people. So what does it mean putting the statement in the foyer building?
Mm-hmm.
On top of all this anti-Asian hatred and prolific violence during the pandemic and the resultant Asian unity narrative, which is to me almost fantasy regarding the differences and fractures amongst our communities. And also this unity is always based on victimization narratives, which is so tiring. Where is our joyful militancy? Where is our emergent powers? So when Monica proposed to do something together around Asian joy, Jessie and I just went for it because, yeah, let's do that. Let's do something about joy rather than, being a victim and talking about fighting against them. Let's put our energy inwardly.
I think the inward energy, we were talking about this before amongst the three of us, like the power of inward energy and joy and the capacity that it sort of like the capacity to like create from that position and like the way that it holds us. I think like one of the things that sometimes we really struggle with is like getting really like bogged down and feeling really heavy from like all the sort of like the news cycle, like, or the Instagram cycle. If you spend a lot of time on Instagram, that's where a lot of people have been sort of getting their news about everything that happens nowadays. And it can be like a really sticky place to end up, especially as like artists. You're being forced to spend more time on Instagram because of the pandemic as well. So joy really, like, for me, was like the intention with that, like with putting that forward. Joy is an opportunity to learn from each other and about each other. So when we were talking earlier about like, you know, what is like this sort of like umbrella of Asianness and how can we be more specific about the nuance that exists within that, is like to talk about our joys, like rather than our traumas. So like one of the things that I was seeing at the time, which was like so common in grief spaces and activist spaces, was really like what Youngsook said, like really a lot of like victimization narratives that love like comparing trauma and histories, and like to such an extent that like no one was absorbing anything from each other anymore. And like there had to be like a better way forward from that, because it started to become like the same thing of like this toxicity of just going around in circles, like going around in circles and creating more trauma. And joy is really, for me, where it becomes an act of resistance, and it's like an act of love, not just for yourself, but also for your community. And joy as a tool can really put us on a path to somewhere new. And I would say that like in this process of like creating from a place of joy, and that being the prompt for making work and trying to make a space where like the community can come, literally come passing on the street and enter the space that we are creating, as we're learning something like so powerful from each other. And we're sharing experiences through like something that feels like really fleeting sometimes, like when you just keep hearing another story about yet another incident of like a hate crime or an assault or something. So yeah, I would say like that was like the primary intention with like using this as a prompt for how do we share stories, and can we share them in a way actually to bring us like closer, and what is the vehicle to do that? And for me, the only thing I could think of was our joy.
I agree to what Monica's like, you know, the way Monica put that, because it also made me reflect on this whole notion of joy, this concept of joy. And then also like what Youngsook, you talked about, this victimization narratives. And in a deeper level of reflection, I feel like joy is really like a silent rebellion, at least with this have you eaten yet, the how we take joy. And because as mentioned earlier, I'm like towards finishing my research, and I did look briefly on Orientalist perspectives, and it made me think a lot of like Orientalist perspectives serve the Western Hemisphere, and joy of, say, the East Asian joy or the face of joy is somewhat tagged to serving joy to the Western Hemisphere, at least in a in colonial world and even post-colonial sort of drips, you know, in society. And rather than presenting our actual joy outside of our own community. And further to that, I was thinking, you know, so within the structure of society, I mean, I grew up under the British education system, the institution, you know, and us ESEA, like our East and Southeast Asian generations are educated through, or many are educated through these education systems and institutions, and they do not necessarily emphasize these aspects of joy within our community. I mean, look, if you studied the British, I'm not sure about the syllabus right now. It's been years since, but you know, when I was studying British history, I was studying British history. You know, I view all the grief and agony of East and Southeast Asia rather than truly any stories of joy. You know, because that's the historical narrative, and that's written within the, you know, the Western sort of eye. So through this deeper reflection, it goes back to my initial response to Monica when she reached out, hey, do you want to do, you know, so I got this theme and of Asian joy. I jumped on it because instinctively I thought of my mother, and I wanted to reflect on care. through my mother, through her grief and joy, this sort of yin and yang, this sort of duality, and through my eyes as a child. So the joy, the mother figure through the joy, the mother figure through the child's eyes, how care is passed on, this legacy of care, this legacy of life and humanity, not just grief and victimization narratives that is just like within society and educative, like within education, just compounded within much of my upbringing, at least, you know. So yeah, so that was my response to Monica's call. And yeah, Youngsook.
Yeah, sunshine appeared. Nothing else to finish first half session.
No, my appearance always means that a break is upon us, but I'm so loath to do this because this is going through so many like interesting avenues, and this notion of joy and East Asian as possibly a source of East Asian resistance and East Asian coherence in a more global scale is something that is really hitting home in so many different ways, not least because as Jessie was talking about, this longing for one's mother. I think especially for us as women living away from our mothers, so far away, if our mothers are still alive, this notion of joy and care is inevitably like really soft, tender spots for ourselves, and also a source of extreme power as well, if we remember these moments, and also if we ourselves are also mothers, and remembering how that what you were saying earlier, Youngsook, about that my story of my mom giving me that egg in my palm and making me eat that before I left the house, because she could see that she didn't understand what I was doing, but she could see that I was not very, with it. And all the thing that she could think of that would help me was just make sure I had some protein in my system. So yeah, I mean, these are moments of that you do want to like rotate around and take apart and relish and make something out of. And so I do want to keep hold of this energy somehow for our second half, remembering joy, thinking about care, and especially what was mentioned earlier on in the conversation about affectionate space. Would love to explore all of these things in our second half. So yeah, we will take a quick 10-minute break. We'll come back shortly before 8 o'clock. Please do come back if you can, and we will continue this conversation then. See ya.
So here's the brief excerpt. In the essay Other, From Noun to Verb, the poet Nathaniel Mackey draws a distinction between the noun other, which is social, and the verb other, which is artistic. Artistic othering has to do with innovation, invention, and change, upon which cultural health and diversity depend and thrive. Social othering has to do with power, exclusion, and privilege. So fast forwarding a bit, Mackey borrows the title from Amiri Baraka. I'm just gonna write that down. Who aptly defines the history of profiting off of Black music as turning a verb into a noun, so the opposite process. For instance, swing, the verb, meaning reacting to music, was a Black innovation before white musicians stole and encased it in the commercial brand swing. Mackey demands we wrest back the white man's noun and return it to a verb by breaking into the colonizer's English and alchemizing new words out of local vernacular. So, Youngsook, I think you wanted to say more about the turning the noun into a verb as part of an essential part of our process.
Yeah, so just to to have a thought challenge. So reading of this, Now think of all the names of our foods and rituals and stories as verbs, not the nouns, petrified into the category of ethnic culture. For example, can you imagine jellyfish salad as a verb? Jellyfish salad as a verb. We found that it certainly becomes a verb when it is served in the reception of art events. It's an explicit gesture of inviting our community members, also the way of taking up space. So it can, jellyfish salad, can or becomes, can be or becomes a verb.
So I'm going to briefly introduce, if I can draw my screen up properly. So bear with me 1 minute. So briefly introduce, can you see the presentation? I just want to confirm with everybody because
No.
there?
I see not the presentation, I see the browser.
That's really weird. Just give me 1 second. I'm just gonna.
Towards the end, Jessie, I think it just kind of it opened up to just a full screen, so it was fine. I think the way you were doing it was okay.
I think it should be this then. Is that better? Is that
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Perfect. Sorry, I have a couple of Google Chromes up and about. So okay, there we go. So just to briefly introduce, Have You Eaten Yet? Which was the event that we held together in July as part of Deptford X Festival. So it's as we discussed at the beginning about have you eaten yet, the statement carrying the equivalent of, how are you in many Asian cultures. So and as instigated by Monica about Asian joy, this was the response to what we decided to create, this sort of affectionate healing space for the local community during Deptford X Festival 2021, which as I mentioned earlier on, Deptford X Festival is held annually and it is within the areas of Lewisham Borough. And this was actually in Deptford High Street itself. This sort of this space that we have created Have You Eaten Yet in. And yeah, so to build through excavated stories, interventions, and performances celebrating radical expressions of Asian joy. So we had, it was a week-long, oh no, sorry, it was like 9 days of exhibition in total for the 9 days of festival in total. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, Monica and Youngsook. My memory is kind of fading. Is it 9 or 10 days? But it's around that.
10 days.
Thank you. 10 days. So yeah, 10 days for the festival itself. And Have You Eaten Yet had performances at the beginning of the festival and a durational performance by Ghost and John at the last day of the festival. And throughout the whole duration, we had the exhibitions that were traces left behind through the various performances by our curator artists. So we had artists, as I mentioned earlier, during the last day, Ghost and John. We also had Kwang Pham. We had Song Soo Kim and Tae-hee, who are all East and Southeast Asian artists. And also, of course, myself, Monica, and Youngsook, we all also took part in the day, like in the launch day of performance, with various different stories and various different narratives, which Monica, myself, and Youngsook will go through shortly. Yeah, so and again, to reiterate, all of this was and is in response to what Monica brought up at the beginning of this project about Asian joy that resulted in Have You Eaten Yet? And here we are at the reflection. Oh, we also had a reflection dinner. That's right, at the exhibition closing, so the last day, and we invited various artists, the artists, and then also various community leaders, various also producers, you know, so that are key to sort of like bring to be involved in these discussions and conversations. Yes, so from next on, I believe, Monica, would you like to talk a little bit about the venue, this beautiful Studio 101 courtyard that we held everything?
Yeah, I'll just go through that really quickly because I just want to be mindful of the space for discussion and questions at the end. Yeah, so in terms of like negotiating venue, so that it works in these sort of like festival context is like that it's somewhere between like either having to find your own space or like being offered a space based off of the organization's sort of like bank of readily available spaces who have like proposed to be an option for the festival. So for me, I felt like it was really important to be sort of like embedded in a very like high traffic area, in an area that was very close to and surrounded by all of the shops on the high street. So on the high street, if anyone's ever been to Deptford, so Deptford High Street has like 5 or 6 Chinese and Vietnamese supermarkets. And also there's a lot of nail salons around as well. So this is a really like for me, like being in and amongst this location was really sort of like everything about the project. So the important part about it was that we were asked to, when considering our proposal, to consider the community, and like what better way to sort of be in condition of the community and the work and the context that you're surrounded by than by locating yourself in a place where everybody can access the project easily. So we really lucked out with this space in Studio 101, and they were really generous about hosting us, and we're really excited by the project and for sort of like inviting in this like energy and transforming their courtyard into a space for community. So we're really grateful that they decided to work with us and move on to the actual work.
Yeah, the first work is A Mountain, a Bundle, a Spell. It was the first performance delivered by all 3 of us. This performance is about creating a safe space by bringing shamanic spells, making and dispensing adukibin talismans in a dumpling shape. It is also about drawing the sense of generosity by gifting the audience the instant noodle beautifully packed with a handwritten letter by the chef Song-soo Kim. We managed to buy about 40 different types of Asian instant noodles. The variety, it was truly joyful experience of shopping, all sorts of different types of Asian instant noodles. I also want to share why we invited Song-soo to this particular performance. We saw the article about Song-soo's experience of working with a white man chef. In the article, she's talking about the chef dismissed her knowledge in Asian food and constantly correcting her with his authority. So basically dismissing her own cultural heritage. But this is not an isolated incident, and many of us experienced similar situations. And we thought it's important to heal this wound together by putting an act about food and gesture. So the second image is also about this performance, a mountain, a bundle, a spell. We're kind of making huge amount of dough, and the adukibins around adukibins is considered to have a shamanic power to, ward off any kind of negative energy and spirit. So we made a dumpling, and inside the dumpling we put adukibins, as so it becomes kind of little talisman, and we kind of gifted this little talisman with instant noodle bundle to the audience at the opening.
Another sort of like element that we wanted to add to the night, and that I felt really strongly about to accompany the sort of like the sensory environment we were creating with this like affectionate energy. So for me, one of the most like powerful things that always like comes up for me when I think about home is smell. So the smell of incense is something that I think like many of us know really well from home, especially if we grew up in like Buddhist or Taoist households. And so like with my performance, I want to just sort of like make this act as a kind of like a ritual cleansing by making this massive incense bomb, so that the smell would literally permeate like even beyond the courtyard. That way people from the street could smell this burning firewood and like follow the scent and into the space. So being like, in other words, like making a really sort of like a powerful like calling card with a very simple act such as like burning the incense. And with that, like with a snake in the house means the family will never want. So that's a really sort of like old saying. It's like referencing, it's not actually referencing like a literal snake, it's referencing like people who are born in the year of the snake on the Chinese zodiac. And it's a kind of like old superstition because like snakes will do whatever they can to make sure that their family won't go hungry. So for me, this was like a title that was like referencing and linking back to like our whole like overarching theme of like care, and also the question of have you eaten yet? And I like the sort of like the reference to these really sort of like archaic and sort of like superstitious, like using a superstition as a way of like transmitting and passing knowledge. So I like what I like even more about it is like in the context of like having like, you know, a family that's migrated and settled in the West, is that these sorts of sayings often get dismissed as like they're kind of a nonsense because like they like don't follow these like any sort of like foundation in like West and like the sort of like logic models that like in the way that people think in the West, that's like coming from Western philosophy. So in the next performance, Jessie.
So the performance I put on performance of a performative act of care, perhaps could say, or it's called Letters to Ma. So it's a documentary project series. I interviewed various children of Asian families talking about their mothers. So referencing back to what I was talking about when I when I responded to Monica's Asian joy theme or concept. And so again, what the children viewed as the joys and success of their mothers through their lives. So in the letters, they do detail of their struggles, but also their success. So again, that duality of grief, but also joy, this humanizing. So humanizing their stories rather than just creating this like archive of sufferings. And I transcribed those letters into, I transcribed those interviews into a letter as a ghostwriter. and wrote it out as a letter to their mother through the eyes and hearts of the children. And I've recently just sent it all out to the various individuals, various participants, so that they could so that they could sign off and they could give to their mothers themselves these letters. So looking at this mother figure, the matriarch within a patriarchal world, and this sort of like act of care. And I think most importantly is to think like the letters is this act of care within this letter space, within this A4 letter space, these words, this transference of care, and how this sort of writing, this pouring and expressing out your words and onto letter to then give to another, is this procedural act of containing and expressing care by one to another, and in this case from us children to our mothers. So yeah, so there were 9 interviews with 10 letters, one being my one to my mother. Yeah, so this is like also like a kind of symbolic for generational passing on of highlighting their strength and resilience. And yeah, it was drew from my own experience of writing letters to my mother when I was younger, as we were separated for majority of my years. So yeah, so that's letters to Ma. And the next is Yellow Furry Lullaby.
Yeah, these images are from the storytelling performance Yellow Furry Lullaby, which I collaborated with Tae-Yo-hye. Yellow Furry Lullaby interweaves the famous children's story We Are Going on a Bear Hunt with a Korean folk tale and the forgotten history of Chinese indentured labor, which quickly replaced the colonial labor after the abolition of black slavery. Marrying this history with the continuing exploitation of migrant workers, this performance tries to acknowledge the historical wounds and therefore collective healing. At the end of the performance, we shared the dandelion liquor with the audience as a gesture of solidarity. In Korea, dandelion is a symbol of grassroots movement and resilience. Tae and I diligently harvested the flowers and roots from various wild grounds last spring and fermented them in soju. Soju is like a working class liquor in Korea as well. So we fermented the flowers and roots in soju with the honey to serve during the performance about community care and healing. So this is made for holding a space.
I had to unmute myself. On the final day of the festival, we had invited Ghost and John, and they came and they occupied the courtyard for the duration that the exhibition was open on the last day. So they did a durational performance in the courtyard called There Are Gods Around Us. And so for this work, they sat on 2 mats in the center of the courtyard, and as audience members would come in over the course of the day, they would engage in exchanges with whoever was in the audience and ask them to participate in these little activities that they had. And so they would share stories about everyday rituals and creating their own gods out of these rituals. So it's explicitly a Asian related practice for an Asian audience, and this was like a really intentional move for them, as a way of sort of like bringing back up that like sort of wisdom and knowledge, and also the way that our gods and these figures that are protecting us, how they change with time and as we continue to tell and retell stories. So that was everything for the performances that we had during the festival. And if Jessie or Youngsook want to add anything, or I think we're actually coming up to the end of our time, so we need to.
Only because, yeah, we it's really, really fantastic to see that, actually, because it just gives some shape and texture to all the things that you've been talking about, like this lovely notion of joy and affectionate space comes through really quite clearly, I think, in a lot of these rituals and acts, I guess, in these performances. So, but maybe a little elaboration on whether this affectionate sort of space, whether this affectionate space came up as a result, emerged out of Have You Eaten Yet, through these performances, or whether this was kind of like a grounding or founding kind of concept for you.
I think it was a founding concept, because when we were preparing, so we had a lot of meetings in the sort of like lead up to like creating this whole program and the events, and then eventually forming a collective from it, where we would meet and we would talk about these things. And there was actually one day that was like really nice, where it was Youngsook, Songsu, and myself in my kitchen, playing with dough and showing each other all the different folds that we knew, and like passing around and like taking turns, like just like, oh, now I know how to do it this way, and like just such a simple activity as that. That sort of being like an organizing device for like then how we start to like share our stories with each other, and like how tender these sort of like moments and exchange. And that really ended up becoming the work itself, were those acts and those like gatherings together to talk about like what we want to do with the performance, what we want to do with the event, and what we want to do with each other.
Yeah, it just harks back to what you'd mentioned earlier, Monica, about in Kathy Park Hong's book, where there's this notion that she's so tentative around this idea of a we, and that it's almost like in these moments where you're able to like just show each other the folds and the dumplings, and this enthusiasm just spills out of you. And this recalls like the conversations that the preparatory conversations leading up to this session that Jessie and Youngsook and I have had, and how it just spills out. And it's like this, it's almost like something gets uncontained, and it just seeps through every pore of your body, and suddenly you feel completely like, oh, there's this, I'm able to access some aspect of joy, of togetherness that otherwise gets tampered down and put away in ways that are really hard to explain, and you don't, it's done just so that you can survive the day to day, you know, in spaces that don't have that understanding or the context for these things to come out. So just in your retelling of the dumpling folding and seeing these sort of like summoning of ghosts and gods, it's like, yeah, I mean, that is so much part of a very private now kind of texture, you know, and bringing that into a public space must feel like, in some way, as Youngsook would probably call it, like sort of shamanic sort of conjuring almost.
I think it's also kind of experimenting around collective aesthetics. As I mentioned in earlier, like we are on the list, but we haven't charted our territory on the map yet. But how we can chart the territory, how we can, you know, put our flag on the tangible, you know, sense of land. I don't know. I think we still don't know who we are. That's the kind of biggest question amongst us. But we haven't really allowed ourselves to explore through the question either. We always kind of demanded to be Asian artists, to provide Asian content, to talk about the heritage, or you know, at the same time, you know, danger of ghettoizing our practice. So it's like, you know, So that's why we kind of keep talking about how we can push back our energy within us rather than, you know, going external. And also the value of collective aesthetics is, and also experimentation around, is in that sense political and radical, because this comes with a lot of questions rather than answers.
Yeah, I agree with what Monica was saying there. It's like a provocation, really, of trying to figure out this collective aesthetics, and just sort of putting these little premises out there, like, if I just put a dumpling out, who's going to come to this, you know? And those who come, that's at least for that moment the we, perhaps, and you know, who is kind of like moved by the call of these rituals and moments of recognition, I suppose.
Yeah. And who's gonna believe the shamanic power of Aduki beans?
Yeah.
And who's not gonna give a damn about this, you know, shamanic gesture? I think it clearly divides, you know, what sort of audience, what sort of you know, people we are inviting to this affectionate space by defining our aesthetics in that sense.
When you were, please.
I wanted to add to that, based on what both of you were saying, Sunshine, what you said about like these private moments, and Youngsook saying like, who's going to give a damn or believe in the Azuki beans? Like, like earlier when I was talking about superstition, and like, because that's also like a very sort of like private thing, because it's like, you know, it doesn't make sense, but you like, you believe it, you have to believe it. Other moments you believe it more or less. And it, like what you were saying about the like these like sort of like private things, it reminded me of the chapter in Minor Feelings about indebtedness, and the sort of like indebted values that like sometimes we carry like in the diaspora, and sort of resisting that. And one of the lines that she said, I took a screenshot of this today because I was like, oh, I'm going to save that for later, was that I can't entirely renounce the condition of indebtedness, but also at the same time, so I can't repay my parents by keeping my life private, or by following the privatized dream of taking what's mine. And it sort of reminded me of that somewhat. Of like taking the risk of like taking what are formerly sort of like private moments, and like, or a general value of like being reserved and a private person, and throwing it out there and seeing what happens.
Yeah,
I think there's also, jumping off that as well, I think I mean, at least in my observations in both personal and professional endeavors, I feel like for future generations to come, there is, I think there could be emphasis on this whole third space concept or third space theory. It's like I've become very interested in it because it's coined by Homi K. Baba. So it's a post-colonial social linguistic theory, and it talks about hybridization. And why I say this is because when I was observing my work, especially my recent work, I am unable to sort of, I can't say that I do not have influences from the Western sort of, like the Western influences or Eurocentric influences. At the same time, I cannot deny my own culture and my heritage as well. So I think moving forward in terms of understanding this diaspora and this sort of art practice and art making within this diaspora, I think at least East Asian artists, or at least myself as an East Asian artist, or East Southeast Asian artist, Malaysian Chinese, I think it's very crucial that, and also considering this sort of moving on from the previous generations of our mothers, our grandmothers, where there's a complete different social practice about sharing, you know, hence why all these care practices I feel in Have You Eaten Yet has become so intensified for me. You know, it's always been there, but it's become intensified as a language itself. And I feel like this could lend credence to understanding what is it to maybe not be in, not the space of, not in either space, but in a unique third space. You know, that's how I understand it, or how I question it right now. You know, yeah.
Yeah, we have to be also careful that we don't tread the waters of authenticity as well, where there's like some authentic way of being East Asian, because that is also kind of retreating to that same binary of here and there. And in fact, it's everywhere, as we are like embodiments of, we are everywhere, this vastness of East Asia. And to make that space legible for ourselves and for others as well. So I am also really aware that we're well over time. It's 25 to 9. I feel so full at the moment, with gratitude and with just yeah, it's just been an amazing conversation to have. Thank you so much, Jessie, Monica, and Youngsook. Thank you everybody also for coming tonight. Very boring thing of doing, you know, these kind of webinars is that we love feedback. We are still ultimately an arts organization trying to survive the needs of tick boxing, as Monica very articulately noted. So, but we do take very seriously everything that you say. So I've just put a little link in the chat box. If you have 2 minutes, I think it's all it's going to take. Then have a click through and just let us know how this went for you, what your thoughts have been. But yeah, on that note, thank you so much everyone for coming tonight. I hope everyone has a great evening. And that's how you in yet in Cantonese.
Thank you,
Hola,
Sunshine, Max, and Vichy as well. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.